Okay, well, great. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Houston, Texas at the University of Houston Clear Lake. It is my honor to introduce to you today our lecture, uh, introducing a memoir, a book from Dr. Heather Diamond. Heather Diamond, originally it was from the Pacific Northwest in the United States. She has lived in Arkansas, Texas, and Hawaii, and now Hong Kong. She received her BFA and MA from the University of Houston, and she is an alumni. And her PhD was in American Studies from the University of Hawaii. During her 25 years in Houston, she worked as a bookseller, a bookstore owner, and also an English instructor at the Houston Community College. In Honolulu, where she lived, she was a university lecturer and a museum curator. She started writing creative nonfiction in her 60s, and since then, her essays has appeared in various literary magazines. Her memoir, Rabbit in the Moon, was released by Camphor Press on May 2021. And now I would like to spend the next hour giving you a chance to hear from Dr. Heather Diamond. I would like to make this dialogue a little bit more casual. And please allow me to give a warm welcome to my very dear friend, Dr. Heather Diamond.
Thank you. It's such an honor to be here. And it's really full circle for me to virtually be in Houston.
Thank you. And you are now in Hong Kong, and we are 13 hours away. And it is morning here in Houston. And we would love to spend the next hour. It will go by really quickly. So I want to very quickly get into the heart of our conversation and have our audience be able to hear. Right now, we have many who are students, our faculty, and also friends and colleagues from all over the world who are tuning in to hear this talk. Before I begin, my name is Gigi Do. Again, I am the Associate Vice President of the Global Learning and Strategy for the University of Houston Clear Lake. All right, so let's get started, Heather. Tell me a little bit about your book, Rabbit in the Moon, and if there's a copy that you can see in the back, and it was published just last month. Please tell us a little bit about your book, and then we can just have a conversation as we go.
Thanks. Okay, Rabbit in the Moon is it's a memoir that covers about a 20-year period, and it tells the story of my midlife romance in my mid-40s, where I went to Hawaii and thought that I was just going there to study China so that I could become a better teacher of Asian studies in Houston. And I fell in love with a Chinese ethnomusicologist from Hong Kong, which caused a complete sea change in my life. So I was living in Texas, he was living in California at the time, and it looked pretty impossible. But we ended up figuring out a way to start a new life in Hawaii. And I thought that was the end of my midlife reinvention until I got plunged into his very large, extended, boisterous family in Hong Kong and discovered I didn't know anything about cross-cultural relationships or Asia, and I was totally unprepared. So it's the story of my culture shock and my cultural adjustment and my falling in love with Hong Kong and my Chinese family.
Right. Well, before we go into that, I just want to give our audience a little background. Your book starts in 1998 to present, but to give a little background to those of you who don't know Dr. Heather Diamond, she was a colleague of mine in the early 90s when we first started working at the Houston Community College, and we became fast friends, and we talked, and I learned about Houston through you because you were teaching multicultural to our students, and one of your lecture, we invited you in, and we became very good friends, and we went to Vietnam in the mid-90s when it was just opening up. And I think since then, you have just really focused on the areas of Asia, and you really made it ingrained in your life much later on. So chronologically, the major events that I got from your book is that you go, in the 90s, you went to Hawaii for a short program. You met Fred, your now husband, the ethnomusicologist, and you've done some research on Chinese ethnic minorities. You've worked in the museum for the Native American culture, Native Hawaiian culture, excuse me. And your book ends with you coping with the loss of your father, but you gain from both sides of the culture. Foreign becomes familiar. So that's that's just the basis for this conversation that I would love for us to delve in a little bit more. And then we can go into little excerpts of that.
Well, I want to go back to you and me meeting, you and I, because it's embarrassing to say that I got to be my mid-30s and I've never had an Asian friend. You were my first Asian friend. You were my first introduction to Asian culture when I think I went to your sister's wedding, and I started going to various places in Houston that I had not been before, and then also through my students there as well. And going to Vietnam was my very first trip to Asia. And then after that, I went to Singapore and China and Hong Kong, and I've seen a lot more of Asia since then. So it's quite remarkable to me that now when I look back and think that I could have gone that long without really knowing anything about Asia, and then that it's become an integral part of my life since then. I would never have thought that I would end up living here. In fact, given the kind of personality that I have, and the fact that I'm an introvert and I like quiet and I like dim lighting, this is the last place I would choose for me. And I would probably go, someplace in Europe. And to come here was a huge adjustment because it's the aesthetic, the cultures was so foreign to me, even though I had done a lot of research, I'd done a lot of studying, but what I learned in books had very little to do with what happens when you're on the ground and you're in the midst of a culture.
And you know what's really interesting that I never had a chance to tell you until now is when we started to learn about Vietnam and learn about the Asian culture for you in the mid-90s, prior to that, I came to the United States about 15 years before that, and as refugees, most of us, as soon as you get into the new land, you really bury the past so you can catch up with the present. And I think a lot of my understanding about my culture was awakened during our friendship, because I had to really explain to you all these cultures. And I think through the years looking back, I said that was the point when I really truly appreciate the culture that I grew up in. But then what it did for me is that it made me appreciate the new life, the new culture that I also accumulated, who my children were born into it. So it's just, I think it's really, that's
really fascinating to me, because I think that's true for my husband as well, because he grew up in Hong Kong. He went to school, did his undergrad at the very campus where we live right now, the Chinese University of Hong Kong. But then he went to London, and then he went to the United States. He did all his graduate work in Illinois. Then he taught at Cal Poly in California. And so much of his life, the same, was learning to be an American. He's an American citizen, and he got very far away from his roots. But then because I was so interested in, I'm trained in folklore studies and cultural anthropology, I was fascinated by the traditions in his family, and he had to explain them to me. And so the very same thing happened, that through explaining it to me, he also got into researching his own culture as well. And he was doing that some with music already. So, it's a nice coming together, because both of us are teachers. We are comfortable explaining each other's cultures to each other, rather than, sort of just throwing each other into it and expecting us to swim.
You know what I really love about your book that makes me think of how an outsider looking at coming into a culture where you talked about sitting into your husband's family and to introduce them and just understand the culture, in my experience, I've always been the insider watching the outsider coming into our culture and watching how they react to certain nuance or certain, things that we do, but then having you describe that. So so my second question is that you describe a lot of those cultural differences in your book, and in between your life in Hawaii as well as later on in Hong Kong. Can you give us an example? I would love to have you read it, but I'm catching you off guard here.
Okay.
Read for us an excerpt of one of those examples that you.
The cultural difference.
Yes, we would love to hear that.
I have a section that I think, because everybody can identify with food, I'm going to read a food section in here.
Yes.
And I think that this is a chapter where I had gone to Hong Kong, I think for the very first time, and was meeting Fred's extended family. We weren't even married yet. And I was eating with them at home. In Asian restaurants in Hawaii, I'm used to eating family style where everyone shares the dishes. Eating at number 10, and number 10 is the family home there, is different in ways that would horrify my mother, the nurse. No serving chopsticks to protect us from germs, everyone reaching across the table to take what they want, all talking at once and with their mouths full. Without knives, everyone but me mysteriously separates chicken and fish bones from meat inside of their mouths and then spits the bones directly onto the paper placemats. I try not to see the mounting pile of bones, not to think about germs moving from mouth to serving dishes and back again. Home style, Fred has explained, not restaurant style. Although I am deft with Louisiana crawfish and I grew up eating Dungeness crabs, I'm baffled about how to eat unshelled shrimps covered in sauce. Paralyzed by my middle-class American upbringing. Don't talk with your mouth full. Don't reach across the table. Don't raise your voice. Don't spit out food. I meekly eat the deboned pieces of fish and the peeled shrimp Fred piles onto my rice. I smile, but hate feeling like a toddler or a baby bird.
That's interesting. I love that. And in your book, you also talk about boutique multiculturalism. Can you explain that a little bit? I mean, I love that phrase, but I don't think that I have heard that before. But then
actually, I encountered it first at HCC. So I heard it in some kind of a presentation that was given at HCC, and it actually comes from an educator named Stanley Fish talking about boutique multiculturalism back when it wasn't as well, I guess as debated a term as it is now. But it still holds in many ways, and the idea is that people are interested in the food and the dance and the costumes, but not so much the people. We like the exotic kind of paraphernalia, but not to have those people living in our neighborhood or having to adjust to them or having to incorporate their ideas into our way of living. So it's a term that really applies to a superficial way of appreciating someone else's culture without really getting inside of it and understanding the values and beliefs that may or may not just agree with your own, and finding ways to navigate that.
I think for me, just to have anyone outside of my culture who just express a slight interest in it, to me is just an honor. And so I never really think that you got to really delve into this to understand. I think just the mere interest of that for a lot of us, we think that that's just that is just really good for us. But I'm just wondering, like in your perspective, I feel like you really want people to really fully understand that too, and I think that's great. But it's okay, I think for me it's just, if that makes sense.
It does, but doesn't it depend on context as well? I think, first of all, I think of Hawaii immediately because I spent 20 years in Hawaii, and I was a curator in a Native Hawaiian historical museum I was one of the very few haole means foreigner or white, one of the few haoles working there, and really had to constantly be thinking about how to present Hawaiian culture in a respectful way and in a way that accorded with the way people want to be presented, so that I'm not speaking for people, but I'm enabling them to speak for themselves. And yet in Hawaii, you have the predominant image is tourist culture, and that's people coming in and they want to dance the hula, and they want to wear grass skirts, and they want to go to a luau, and they want to, you know, so they appropriate bits and pieces of the culture, but they have very little interest in actual Hawaiians or in the history, or particularly the ugly side of the history. They don't want to know that Hawaii monarchy was illegally overthrown by the United States, for example. That's very difficult for a lot of people to swallow, and they didn't learn that in school in America. So, you know, they want the happy aloha culture, but they don't want to have to grapple with the disenfranchisement, the health issues, you know, all of the various issues of inequity that have resulted from the kinds of actions that have been taken there politically. Wow. So I think it depends on the context, you know, and in Asia, it's a very different situation. I mean, Hong Kong is a space that was colonized, and you know, it's very politically fraught in many ways. But in terms of the culture, you know, people come in at different levels, and even expats that live here, it's entirely possible to live here for many, many years and never involve yourself with local Chinese culture. You could live in a, you know, an elite bubble and only deal with other expats, or you can immerse yourself more and learn more about the people.
You know what's interesting about your book is that you wrote it in your later life. It makes me as a reader wants to know, well, what happened in her previous life? I mean, her previous years that led to this, but I'm going to give the audience a little bit background of that would segue into my next question about your years in Hawaii. So here we are in, you know, probably like 1998 or 1999 when you have a great career in Houston. And you were doing all these research on multicultural, projects that you were doing. You had a beautiful home in the Heights and all of that. And then one day, you said, "Oh, I'm going to go to Hawaii to the East West Center for a summer long program." And you came back. You said, "You know what? I'm going to do my PhD in the University of Hawaii." And you just took off. And I just said, "Wow!" And then over the years, I look back, the things that you incorporated, that you learned, that you reshared to all of us. And I look back. I said, you know, what you don't know, what you didn't know then, really led to something that I think is just profoundly invaluable for someone like me to learn. So I'm going to ask you this. So when you went to Hawaii to get your PhD in American Studies, how did that academic background influence how you perceive other culture, or did what you learned there is different than how you now see it? I mean, I guess my question is that, was there anything that was not quite true of what you learned in your American Studies versus what you really acknowledge now? There's
a lot of layers to that.
I know, but
let me go back to, first of all, I have my University of Houston degrees are in art and English. And when I was studying English, I was studying folklore. And so I've always been interested in folklore, which is sort of unofficial culture, and everything from storytelling to handicrafts to belief systems and rituals and all of that. So that probably already colored my thinking in terms of the kind of literature that I was teaching and reading, and my interest in reading literature from multi-ethnic groups in the United States in particular, and then works in translation coming from elsewhere. So I was already very interested in cultures other than my own. Then I went to, as I said, I went to Hawaii just because I was I actually did 2 summers there where I was doing study on Japan and China at the East-West Center. And for those of you who don't know, the East-West Center, I should have known this. They are a legendary incubator of intercultural relationships. So I should have already had a warning light going off in my head. But anyway, they collected students from around the Pacific Rim. I would say maybe a third of the students were from the US and the rest were from throughout the Pacific and throughout Asia. So I kind of got introduced to that in the summertime and thought, I really want to be here. I want to spend more time here. And I went into American Studies there, which sounds like it's got nothing to do with Asia, but because it's in Hawaii and it's in the middle of the Pacific, it's very transnational. So the American Studies there is like American Studies everywhere, is pretty much focused on race, class, and gender, but with a very Pacific focus. And so a lot of the instructors there are people that teach Philippine studies. My advisor is from Tokyo, and she teaches and writes a lot about Japan-America relations. So I had a taste of all of that. Plus I had to study an Asian language. So I got immersed into a much more kind of transnational environment there. And I also had to move, because I had a fellowship from the East-West Center, I had to move into an international dormitory at the age of 46, where everybody was half my age and younger than my daughter. So that was kind of strange. And I'd never lived in a dorm. But I was in an environment where I was being exposed to people that came from places I'd never even heard of. I ended up doing my dissertation on, which is actually this book, American Aloha, Cultural Tourism and the Negotiation of Tradition. I did my dissertation and then this book on Hawaii's multiculturalism, because I had to unlearn everything I learned in Texas to understand Hawaii, because the culture was so different and the multiculturalism was completely different. So I've just had this kind of changing paradigm, and my academic interests have kind of followed my personal interests through all of that. That was a really long answer, but I hope that kind of got at what you're asking.
I think what made it interesting though, so this was like 98, 99, before, online distance learning really took off. So I like how everyone is incubated, right? They come into from all over the world, coming into that center to really focus on helping each other learn. I wonder how different that is now with the ability of bringing people in online. And do you think that the ability to see people directly living with them is much more different than just hearing it from a screen, people telling you what it's like and such? I think there's so much value that I hope that will never go away, is to bring people together face to face.
Yeah, I see 2 sides of that, because in Houston, of course, I had an international classroom every time I taught there, and it was an incredible experience. And people from all over the Middle East, people from all over Africa, a lot of Vietnamese students, and it was just this incredible mixture. And I did see some really powerful things happen in the classroom when people who maybe had never been to each other's neighborhoods sat next to each other and had a conversation, particularly around folklore, because this is where food and home rituals, those kinds of things, when you talk about those things, they're safe topics and people can start finding their commonalities. And so I saw some incredible things happen. But I also taught online for somewhere between 8 and 10 years, I think, a long time. And I taught Hawaii's multiculturalism online, in the classroom and online. And other things happened in the online classroom, where one of my favorite things about the online classroom is nobody can sit in the back. They all have to talk, so they may not have been confronting each other face to face, but they're writing in ways that go deep and cause other kinds of encounters. So I don't know, I think I've learned as much in those those multi-ethnic classrooms as the students have in either case. And I hope they have as well.
Okay. So you go through all those years in getting your PhD, you work as a curator, and then what year did you actually move to Hawaii, to Hong Kong, and why? I know your husband, started to work for the university there, but what year was that, and what, and then from that point, I want to talk about your discovery of Hong Kong. But tell me a little bit what started for you.
Well, I started going to Hong Kong. I mean, I moved to Hawaii in 1999 to start grad school. He moved there in 2000. 2001, I made my first trip to Hong Kong. And so I made a couple of trips to Hong Kong, 2 or 3 trips. And then we moved there for a year between 2007 and 8. And that's the central part of my book. And that's kind of a season of festivals when we're living on the small island of Changjiao, which is where my husband grew up. He's not from Hong Kong, the city. He's from the country. So a little island that's a ferry ride away from the main part of Hong Kong. So that was my experience of Hong Kong, was being very close to his family in a more remote area. And then we went back to Hawaii and we moved here in 2018. So we've been here since 2018 now.
Okay, well, before we go to Hong Kong, there's a question that we have on a Q&A that's going back to your years of living in a dormitory. And I find this is really fascinating. So how did living in a dormitory affect your understanding of the culture, or just simply change your experience?
Oh, first of all, you have to understand the dormitory. The dormitory almost gets its own chapter in my book, because it was an early project done by the famous architect I.M. Pei, and we always joked that it was one of his student experimental projects. It was designed to make students not want to stay in their rooms. The rooms were so small. They were 7 by 14. They were like a coffin for a big man. They were really tiny, and they were these little rabbit warrens. And then we had communal kitchens with shared stoves, shared refrigerators, and these outdoor balconies, or lanais as they call it in Hawaii, where people ate. So there were a lot of communal spaces and very tiny individual spaces that were designed to force you out of them so that you would commune with each other. And because I was 40 something and I was used to having my own house and my own space, it was much more difficult for me, I think, than it was for these young people who were like, oh, I've got my own room. This is really exciting. And they were much more adaptable. And my being in the middle of my life and having given up space to be in there, I had a really big adjustment just learning how to, first of all, I didn't even know how to use a rice cooker. I had to be taught how to use a rice cooker, and I didn't like sharing, and it shared bathrooms with signs on the sides that were supposed to be flipped over for men and women, but most of the time people were in too big a hurry and they'd only flip one and forget to do the other. And, so I lived in constant fear that somebody was going to walk in while I was in the bathroom. And other people were just sort of blasé about that. But there were a lot of people that came from cultures where men and women didn't mix. So it was really hard for them too in other ways. So there were so many levels of cultural adjustment. I think one of the chapter I have on my dorm living talks about a war between the Japanese and the Chinese in the dorm, because they were criticizing each other for various things. I'll let people read that part, but there were all sorts of things going on between the cultural groups.
What's
there was a Vietnamese cooking club, by the way.
What's interesting is that Houston is relatively a newer city than, I would say, the Pacific Northwest or along the West Coast Asians who have lived there for generations. So I've lived in Houston for 30 years now, and we have a big, robust Asia town here where you have the Chinese community, Korean, Taiwanese, Vietnamese, Laotian. I just find, because I'm really ingrained in that community, I don't see the case system that you described in Hawaii, where certain Asian group comes first, and then the second group comes, and then all of a sudden there's this turf, right? And I think that's fascinating because I think for a lot of the audience, if you live in Houston, it's really hard for them to really grasp that kind of level of
yeah, I think for people that haven't read the book, I'll just give a little background on that. In the book, I talk about how Hawaii's multi-ethnic population operates on, people talk about it as plantation mentality there. That they're, because Hawaii has a very different history, it has a colonial history, it was a monarchy. They brought in contract workers in waves, so they came, years ahead of each other and got settled in, and then the next group came in. They worked together on the plantations where they developed a common Creole language, and there was a lot of intermarriage as well. I'm vastly oversimplifying here, but the history is very different than it is on the mainland in the continental United States. And there is this sort of pattern of looking down on the more recent immigrants. It's sort of a pecking order that happens there.
All right, so before Rabbit in the Moon, you talked about the book American Aloha. How did your previous experience of writing and publishing that book affect this memoir? First question. And despite of the obvious, content differences, American Aloha being the Hawaiian studies, did you feel a connection between that book to this memoir of the contents of itself?
Yes and no. Yes, in that they both reflect my interest in folklore, and I have a lot of stories about the various festivals and family celebrations and the details of those events in my memoir. In my first book, which was my dissertation, I am focusing on a festival. It's Smithsonian Folklife Festival, so I'm also giving a lot of details. So my same interests are behind both of those. My interests in culture and the ways in which people express their culture in an everyday way. But it's vastly different. I felt like I had to unlearn everything that I learned about academic writing in order to write a memoir. Because when you write an academic book, you're being objective and fact-based and research-based. Everything has to be supported. And there's kind of a formula to how one writes an academic book. And I think the most important thing was that I was trying to forefront the voices of the people I interviewed in my academic book. Then going to a memoir, it's all about me. So I'm writing about, it's also about my Chinese family and my husband, but it's very personal, very intimate, writing about my inner thoughts, my reflections, what I'm learning from this, using myself to hopefully get at some more universal things. So one is going from the outside in and the other is going from the inside out. And then on a practical level, I think you just have to learn to stop writing really long sentences and using huge words that nobody understands when you're writing.
I remember when we used to travel in Vietnam way back when, I was just really struck that you were just walking around with me with a notebook, and everything I said, you start writing it down. And I just find that, I said, wow, she really is interested in what she sees here. And I just find it so refreshing. Do you remember that one story that I told you when we were traveling, that we were talking about a folklore? It was not really a folklore, a story. One of my relatives in Vietnam said, well, here's the cemetery of our ancestor, buried in this casket. And one night, one of our that relative had a dream that person who died in the casket came and said, my foot hurts. And then when they dug up that casket, turns out there was a root from a tree nearby that just punctured into the casket. And, for me, I said, okay, well, no big deal. But then you wrote it in and you were so fascinated with it. And then I started to tell all my relatives to dig up more story and tell her.
Yeah, that's the,
Down.
I'm obsessed. I can't help it.
But no, I think
And
that's,
I've sort of done that with Fred's family as well, which was very interesting because I'm the outsider and I felt like a foreigner and I wasn't the first wife he brought home. And I worried so much about fitting in and I don't know the language. But when we lived there for a year, I was always taking pictures and taking notes. And the same thing, one evening, I think they've been doing an offering for, I don't know if it was the 15th day of the month or something special, but they do. And I remember my mother-in-law, in translation, of course, saying she wondered if the young people would do this when they were all gone, if the traditions were changing. And she started saying that she hoped that I would write all this down because she knew I was writing a blog at the time. And then she wanted the children to read my blog because she wanted them to read my blog so they could learn why they do the things they do. And she would call us and say, we're putting out an offering, tell Heather to bring her camera. So I kind of became like I had a role, like I was kind of the family anthropologist. And I felt like, okay, this is something I can do. Maybe I can't participate, but as an insider outsider, I can record these things for them, for posterity. And I'm really glad that I did because now that I've come back, 12 years later, when we first came back here, I've already seen that a lot of those traditions are changing, either because people are too busy or because that people are getting older and they're forgetting the recipes or they're forgetting certain things or people have dispersed because the children have gotten married and moved away. So I feel like it's doubly important that we have some kind of a record of the rituals that they were doing, and they were doing rituals that a lot of other people had already stopped doing.
Your work has more impact than you know. Let me just tell you this story that I never got to tell you. So if you remember in the 90s, you came to me, you said, hey, the Texas Folklife, was it Texas Folklife Commission? There's an organization in Texas. It's called the Texas Folklife Commission. I have to look it up, but you said that, they are always funding cultural programs where it's passed down by the word of mouth only, because there's really no ways for people to record that. And so you told me, let's write something that in the Vietnamese community that it's a dying tradition. So you helped me wrote a little grant. It wasn't much, but back then it was $500. And I told you that there was this singing operatic in Vietnamese that is passed down. There wasn't really any book to talk about that, but it's something that is dying tradition. So there was this very, very good Vietnamese woman in living in Houston that she always does this at festival. We came to her and we said, if you teach this, then then we can keep this tradition alive in the Texas Folklife Commission. And she said, well, who's going to be a student? And I said, well, I guess I'll be a student. So I learned to sing that with her. And then one day, the Texas Folklife said, Palacios, it's a little fishing town in South Texas that they have an enclave of Vietnamese students that were born there. They want to learn. So she and I drove down there, did our little concert for them, and they picked that up, and now they have a little school that teach that operatic singing in Palacios, Texas. And that came from your idea.
That's really heartwarming.
Should have told you that so you can put that in the book.
Yeah, those kinds of master apprentice programs, were sponsored actually with seed money from the federal government. And each of the states got money for those. And I've seen that work in Hawaii as well. And they have kept a lot of traditions alive, and they have perpetuated a lot of traditions that would have just died out. So that's a really precious thing. That's a great testimony.
Well, I don't want us to run out of time before we address other questions. So we have an attendee. How did you decide what events to include or exclude in your memoir?
Okay, well,
Anything that won't get you in trouble. Keep it out.
I've already revealed everything. I keep saying nobody ever wants to be married to a memoirist because you will have no secrets because we tell everything. And I'm sure my husband would never have chosen to have his life revealed the way I've revealed it. But, he's a good sport. The central portion of my book is about the year that we lived in Changzhou. And so that was easy because it's the cycle of festivals. I mean, it starts with Qingming, which is the grave sweeping ceremony in the spring, and it goes all the way to the Dragon Boat Festival, which is going on right now, was today. So it's that cycle of festivals. We just passed the Bun Festival. So I sort of oriented it around those. In terms of personal events, this book actually started out to be a lot longer than it was, and I weeded out some things. So I think when you're writing a memoir, you end up cutting away a lot and choosing only what moves your story forward as you figure out what are your main themes. And this is a story about midlife reinvention and about cross-cultural relationship, but even bigger than that, it's about family. So it's really, and I didn't know that when I was writing it. When I was writing it, I thought it was just going to be the center portion. And then I thought it was just about intercultural, my marriage. And then I realized, no, it's really about what I learned from my Chinese family and what that taught me that I took back to my American family. So you start weeding out the things that don't fit with that. So I ended up talking in the last part about my grandparents, my father, my mother, my daughter, those, and then back to my Chinese family. So those were the things that carried those threads of the story through.
I think for the older generation like myself, when I read your book, I said, for me, is that I don't think I can live that down with my husband if he sees me writing all of this and then publish it. But I will tell you, my daughter and her multicultural class loved your book. I think it's the generation, they get to see a glimpse that the elders would never talk about because it's a family secret or things like that. But I think, how would they know unless they have something to read from? So thank you for being a revealer. But
okay, not everybody will say that, so I'll take that.
no, but I think you're going to find different generations appreciate it in different ways. But I have a question here from a Q&A. So while studying different cultures, perhaps you have found cultural differences in humor, and there's a lot of that too. Will you please tell us a funny story or situation demonstrating that there is a universally funny things across cultures? There's so many.
Yeah, I don't know if I can think of anyone, but I can tell you that if you listened into a conversation in my household on any given day, you'd hear us constantly teasing each other in ways that, because we sort of play with race and culture constantly, because that's kind of how we navigate our differences, is by using humor. When we lived in Hawaii, I think we really picked that up because Hawaii people, again, coming from plantation days, there are so many people that are much more mixed race than mixed race people in the mainland, I think, because you go back 5 generations, you've got people intermarrying. So my students were 5 or 6 ethnicities. They might be Chinese, Japanese, Irish, Italian, Hawaiian, and something else. So they navigate that in their families as well by kind of using situational ethnicity constantly. So that there's a whole tradition of ethnic humor in Hawaii. For instance, the word for Chinese is pake, and that's a word that comes from a Cantonese term for uncle, but that came out of the pidgin language. So pake, but it can be used as a noun or it can be used as an adjective. And if it's used as a noun, it means a Chinese person. If it's used as an adjective, it means cheap. So it's a joke about, of Chinese people making jokes about themselves. I have Chinese friends who say you can't out-pake a pake. You can't, because we can bargain shop better than you can. And so we use that kind of humor constantly, or, Fred constantly refers to Western food as haoli food. this is, if we're eating potatoes, we're having Hali food. And if we're having rice, we're having Pake food. So we constantly are playing with those things.
Well, I have a story in terms of cultural differences, a humorous one that I also find in your book is that, in the Asian culture, we respect the elders. There's this undying, you honor the older parents, the older people. So my husband is 5th generation Swedes in Seattle. So the difference that he and I see is he said, when we get together with my parents, they buy our dinner, they pay for everything. But when we go out with your family, the older people get there, not only you buy dinner for them, but you beg them to take your money as gifts because that's the way. And he said it's just a switch of it's that here's one side, they give you, they buy everything for you, but here you buy everything for the elder. So
we just had that discussion. I took a copy of my book out to give to the family on Changzhou, and I had signed it I was going to give individual copies, and then my husband's third aunt said, they're not going to read it anyway, just write one to the Lau family. So I wrote one to the Lau family, and I said, and it's a gift. And she's going, no, you worked so hard, you have to be paid for it. So we went back and forth about whether I could give it to them or she was going to pay me. And finally, I think we came up with some kind of a compromise on that, but it was all the symbolic. She wasn't going to take it if I wasn't going to take her money. And I thought, this is pretty typical.
I have a question from the audience. So in your experience, what were the biggest challenges of being in intercultural relationship?
Privacy. I think privacy for me was the hardest. When I first went to his parents' house, I heard a discussion. We ended up getting the room at the end of the hall that had a separate bathroom because I was American. And he said, Americans like their privacy. But that didn't, every time his mother came, she would knock on the door and open it at the same time and walk in. They were constantly in and out. And there was no sense that I had. And I said, she's getting in my personal space. And he said, what are you talking about? There is no personal space in a Chinese family. So now I find it really funny, but at the time I kept saying, what if we're not dressed? How can she keep walking in?
But you know what? I have to tell you, it's been years since you went back to Vietnam. Vietnam now is so much American mainstream than what the tradition because now you have internet. When I go back to different countries, they learn that the internet is the fastest way to it's such a transformation that I think it's true that you now can really go to most countries and don't feel that you're really out of place because people have really adapted the norms across different cultures now, certain norms. If that
I
makes
think that's also depends on rural and urban as well.
Right. You're right about that.
If you're in urban Hong Kong and people still live in nuclear families and small apartments, but my in-laws still live in a more old-fashioned way where there are 3 couples that live together, 3 brothers live together. And when my husband was growing up, there were 20-some people in the house and 5 generations. And I thought, oh, all Chinese families are like this. And then I found out, no, other families were saying, oh, they're kind of the ideal. They're the old style. So it just depends on the family and the area. And I think, it's changing faster in an urban environment.
So I want to know, outside of your husband, his family, what are their reactions to your book? Have they read it yet?
I'm trying to think if anybody has told me they've read it. Several people have it, but nobody has gotten back to me yet. So I'll let you know.
I think if they've
been very supportive, and they've been very, very, very congratulatory about it, but nobody has said anything yet about the content.
Well, then they have not read it. If they say, oh, it's really good, then I don't think that, because there are certain parts in there that I think that I think that you are correct. They don't understand that you're writing it from your perspective. But if they read it from their perspective, they would say, that's not how it is. But then they forget that, this is a memoir. This is how one perceives certain things. So yes, if they say it's all good, they did not read it.
Well, I hope I wasn't offensive, but I think that's always an issue. It's always an issue in memoir writing. Some people end up with family members not speaking to them. I don't think mine is that kind of memoir, but yeah, you always take a risk and everybody has a disclaimer in the front that says, this is my perspective. Memory is an unreliable thing. And of course, other people might remember things differently.
But you have to remember, out of one critic, you're going to have like 1,000 fans. So keep that in mind.
I've heard really nice things back from, particularly from my American-born Chinese friends in Hawaii, which has been really nice. So I feel good about it.
We are running out of time, so I want to save the last couple of minutes on some of the questions that I really want. So what do you hope your readers would take away from your book?
Oh, I would hope that, if nothing else, that my book provides at least a glimpse into the ways in which people can navigate cultural difference respectfully and appreciatively. I don't think that, and I think for me, the biggest lesson was that interdependence, being part of a big family doesn't have to compromise my independence, but that American culture is flawed, just like every other culture, and we have to be able to get over ourselves if we're going to get along with other people.
Yeah, but one thing I do appreciate about the American culture that I didn't get from my Vietnamese culture is that the ability to just listen. I mean, I really do think that in the American culture is that, they encourage that, to listen and to talk it out, where there's a suppression, or at least in my generation as we grow up, is that if you're sad, don't let anyone know. If you're angry, don't let anyone know, or such. But if you're happy, flaunt it. If you have something, flaunt it. So, I do, and one thing I do really, I mean, I don't know if I told you this before, but I feel I'm so American when I go into the Vietnamese culture. I said, wow, that's not how we do it. But then, is it when you move in and out of different culture, I find that I have adapted to identities.
I even feel that way. I feel that way and in fact, the last part of my book is really about reverse culture shock. If you spend a lot of time in another culture, now I go back to the US and I feel very out of place. And I think that anyone who, I've heard this from other expats too, anyone who travels or lives in another culture and comes back sees their own culture objectively and often feels like an insider outsider at all times, which can be an advantage, but it also can be very disconcerting.
Okay, so what make you appreciate more about the American culture that you grow up with after being living in Hong Kong and being absorbed into another culture? What makes you appreciate what you grew up with, that tradition?
I don't know if it's tradition so much as I just appreciate space. I mean, Hong Kong is really small and really crowded and it's full of people. And so, I get back to Washington State and it's like, it's huge. Everything's so big. I like grocery stores with wide aisles, which is something here makes me crazy because you have aisles where I'm small. I have to go sideways and I can't get through. So it's things like that I appreciate. So, there are many things that I do appreciate. On the other hand, I find that I have gotten so used to the togetherness of Fred's family that my family's tendency to spend short periods of time together and disperse feels really weird. So, it's just kind of getting to a point of understanding that they're very different and I have to kind of adjust myself in both places.
I think it's important to have these documentation that you wrote in your memoirs. I guess in my line of work as an international educator, I learned that there are so many sides to everything. And you have to take those those sides in order to make a comprehensive, accurate assessment of the situation. And so I come to really appreciate that, is that, I don't like to hear things just one-sided and here's one perspective. There's always different recognition that from different perspectives that I think that should be respected. And so I really appreciate that, what you write. And I think by reading it, it makes this conversation for me to be able to have much more meaningful with you. So we are coming to the last 4 minutes, and I want to hear, what is your next project?
It's another cross-cultural project, but it's cross-cultural in America. When I was 18, I moved from Washington State to the Ozark Mountains in Arkansas, and I had never been to the South. And believe it or not, I couldn't understand anything anybody said, and they were speaking English. So that was my first cross-cultural experience. So, that's going to be more of a chronicle of the hippie era, the Back to the Land movement, and my years in Arkansas before I came to Texas. So that's what I'm working on now.
I love the state of Arkansas and I think I told you this, is in 1975 when we were on the first couple planes coming from Vietnam, fleeing the fall of Saigon, or on the other side, the victory of Vietnam. We landed in California, and at that time we were on the tarmac for hours because the governor of the state of California would not let us deboard. And looking back, maybe it's because there wasn't permission for these aliens to get off the plane. But in 4 hours, the governor of Arkansas said, bring them in. And then we were put in the Fort Smith camp. And I think after that, planes after planes just came in, and that's where the Vietnamese refugee resettled. And I remember driving through into the camp. There were a lot of Americans standing at the side of the road waving to us. And that was so heartwarming. 20 years later, when I did my first talk in one of the conferences, I thanked the people of Arkansas for their welcoming us, into the new land. So anyways, we have to wrap up because our Zoom is going into another session. But I want to thank you. Thank you so much, Heather, for giving us this opportunity to share with our university of your memoir. And just for the audience to know, if you are on campus, our bookstore had ordered a lot of these copies. Please stop by and pick up one. Or in our office, we have a couple copies too on loan. Or Heather, is there any way that we can share your contact information? Should our audience would like to contact you directly?
Yes, I have a website. It's heatherdiamondwriter.com. Okay. And the best part about writing a book is hearing from readers. So I would love to hear from people. And there's a contact form on my website. So it's heatherdiamondwriter.com.
Okay. Well, Heather, thank you so much, and good luck, in everything in your next project. And we are very proud of you for bringing this, to us and to have this great conversation with us. I wish we could talk longer, but maybe the next time we can host the next round of your project.
Thank you. It's been an honor to be here.
Have a great summer, and stay cool. I'm sure that the weather in Hong Kong is not any different than what we're experiencing now in Houston.
Same in Houston. Thank you.
Thank you, Heather. You have a great day. Great night. Bye-bye.